On 23 March 2014, the World Health Organization reported the first case of the Ebola virus in the forested rural region of southeastern Guinea. This marked the beginning of the catastrophic Ebola epidemic, which devastated the entire West African regional bloc. In June 2016, when the epidemic ended, more than 28,600 people had been infected and over 11,325 people had died. The World Health Organization declared the outbreak of Ebola a public health emergency of international concern. To this day, the origins and widespread transmission of the West African Ebola epidemic is still subject to debate among researchers across various disciplines. These are debates that my next guest is quite critical of. Dr. Chernoh is a Sierra Leonean journalist, academic, political activist, and human rights advocate. He is currently living in exile in the United States, where he is a postdoctoral fellow in public service at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. His book, The Ebola Outbreak in West Africa, Corporate Gangsters, Multinationals, and Rogue Politicians, was published by the Africanist Press, and it can be accessed on the link that I'm going to paste right in the description panel on the upload for this video. Enjoy the show. Dr. Chernoh, welcome to the show and thank you so much for making the time.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Wonderful. I'm very glad. So I see that on your profile it says you are both a journalist and a historian. Can you tell me more about that?
Yes, I have been a journalist for more than 20 years. I started journalism during the period of Sardinian conflict. And I have edited newspapers in West Africa, and I'm currently the editor-in-chief of the Africanist Press, which is a media agency and investigative journalism project that focuses on anti-corruption, the promotion of free speech, and democracy in Africa. Our work predominantly has focused on West Africa as a region that we hope to use to illustrate issues of governance, accountability, and transparency. Professionally, academically, I'm also a historian. I have been trained as a historian. My PhD is in African history. I specialize in the medical, legal, and economic history of West Africa. And currently, I hold a postdoctoral fellowship with the Chabraya Center for Historical Studies at Northwestern University in Illinois.
Thank you so much. So now let's get to talk about the book, The Ebola Outbreak in West Africa. What would you say are the core ideas of this book, and what is its central argument?
As you already know, but between 2014 to 2015, the world was inundated with news about the outbreak of the Ebola epidemic in West Africa. And it mostly affected three countries in West Africa, which include the countries of Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea-Conakry. And these three countries constitute what we call the Mano River region of West Africa. Is endowed with all kinds of mineral and energy and environmental resources. We're talking about diamonds, gold, bauxite, aluminum, and other kinds of resources, including marine resources. So it's a rich corner of West Africa, but interestingly, it has a shared history of violence that predominated that part of Africa in the 1990s, conflicts, civil wars, military coups. So the instability in that region has been ongoing. And it is within that context that we had a massive disease outbreak in 2014 and 2015 that claimed the lives of thousands of people. So as is always the case when there's a disease outbreak, there's a tendency to explain the origin of that outbreak, the cause of the disease, and how the outbreak or the epidemic started. For our own purposes in West Africa, the explanation or the narrative around the origin of the outbreak was produced by a group of European scientists led by Fabian Lenders from the Robert Koch Institute in Berlin, who traveled to Guinea-Conakry in West Africa in December after they were commissioned by the World Health Organization to investigate the causes of the outbreak, how the outbreak started. And following their visit in Guinea, they came out with a report that was published in December of 2014, which claimed that the outbreak originated from what they call zoonotic causes. They produced a report called The Zoonotic Origin of the West African Ebola Epidemic, which was published. Key part of the report stated that the index cases of the outbreak, started in this little village called Miliandu of Guinea, and they identified a little boy at the time who they claimed was a 2-year-old named Emil Wamanu as the index case of the outbreak. Their suggestion was that the virus was transmitted to this little boy, this 2-year-old, from a bat. They believed that, or they claimed that the child had participated in hunting and grilling of a bat, and having ate that bat, which they believed was infected with Ebola, then the virus moved from the bat to the child, and then the child got sick and died of what they believed was Ebola. And the child's family members, including the mother of the child, were subsequently got infected, according to the report. And individuals who traveled from nearby communities in Sierra Leone and Liberia to witness the funeral appear to have transported the disease to Sierra Leone and Guinea. So that report formed the basis of the dominant narrative, which claimed that the outbreak originated in Guinea, that the 2-year-old boy was the index case, and that the village of Miliandu was the site for the origin of the outbreak. So from the way I'm describing it, you already know that there were many problems in this narrative. So when the report was published, it was picked up by academics and journalists. International media propagated that narrative. They said the outbreak that killed thousands of people in West Africa was the result of zoonotic causes, that the child in question was the index case of the outbreak, and that the outbreak began in began in Guinea, in the southern region of Guinea, and individuals who traveled to attend the funeral ceremonies of these index cases were actually the people who are responsible for the transmission, for the creation of the chain of transmission that led to this regional epidemic. So on the surface of it, when I read the report, I knew that there were, I questioned in my mind how the ability of the child to participate, a 2-year-old child to participate in the said act of hunting and grilling of a bat. So I decided to investigate the authenticity of the report. And I also traveled to the region, interviewed, met with the family members of the child, remaining family members of the child, including the father of the child. And I also interviewed residents of the village in Miliandu and nearby communities. So I did my own investigation as a journalist at the time to find out exactly whether the outbreak originated in this village, as was reported by this group of German scientists, and whether the child in question actually was the index case of the outbreak. So in my investigation, I uncovered a number of things that, in fact, the report had omitted significant details of the family members of this child, including the fact that at the time there was no mention of the father of the child. And he was still alive and was never sick, was never infected. And he appeared to have taken care of the so-called index cases, including the child. He was in close contact with them. So, and one important thing that we discovered was the fact that the child was in fact 18 months old at the time of his death. He was not even 2 years old. And the age of the child is very crucial here because it raises the question of the ability of the child to participate in the act of hunting and grilling of a bird. Even if the child was 2 years old,
yes,
for a child, 2 years old child to participate in that act of hunting a bird and grilling and eating a bird, he or she may have, will be able to do that by participating in the said act with a group of other older children, and the report made no mention of that. So in other words, I uncovered serious inaccuracies in the report, including the discrepancy in the age of the child and a number of other issues. So my book is directly a response to that, what I call that dominant narrative, which lacked clinical evidence, which had identified supposed index cases and a site of origin of the outbreak, which there was no evidence to support the conclusions of the report. So I wondered why the media and sectors of the academy took upon that narrative and propagated it and popularized it without raising initial questions. So in my book, I pointed out some of these inaccuracies, including, like I said, the child, and then raised the question: if Miliandu, or the southern region of Guinea, is not the site where the outbreak started, then what and where is the potential place?
Yes.
So, for the outbreak. So in the course of my investigation, we uncovered that there had been in West Africa, in Sierra Leone, in the eastern part of Sierra Leone, a consortium of biodefense research organizations that have been operating in the region, at least from 2004, that is 10 years before the outbreak. And this consortium included scientists and researchers from Tulane University, from Harvard University, from MIT, the Broad Institute, and a number of other universities and pharmaceutical companies who have been using Eastern Sierra Leone and the Chernoh Government Hospital in Eastern Sierra Leone as a site for to carry out a biodefense research that was funded by the United States government and a consortium of other international organizations from Europe, who were trying to understand, who had identified certain pathogens as having potentials for weaponization. And one of those pathogens include Lassa fever, and dengue fever is part of it, Ebola is part of it. But they were funding a Lassa fever research to find out exactly not just the pathogenetics of Lassa fever, but how the pathogen can be weaponized. And in the event that it is weaponized and deployed against security interests, what diagnostic tools and defense mechanisms can be developed in response to such a situation. So this came off from the anthrax incident that happened in the United States in 2001, where security, political leaders, and defense authorities in the United States and in Europe were now concerned about the potential use of bioweapons, pathogens, as part of the global modern warfare, and they wanted to find out exactly how they could defend their own populations, protect their own countries in the event that terrorist organizations or other kinds of entities or countries they are struggling against might develop and use some of these pathogens that have the potential to be weaponized. So my book enters into that discussion and illustrates the use of Sierra Leone as a site for a biodefense research project. And I raised the question whether this outbreak that unfolded 10 years later, after the inception of this research program, are not related. And not only that, calling for an investigation and a scrutinization of the kind of activities that these organizations, consortium of universities that were engaged in this research, have been carrying out. So we raised questions of informed consent, the ethics of biodefense research, and the implication of situating dangerous research program in a dilapidated hospital environment in Sierra Leone, where the infrastructure and the facilities that will support such kinds of research endeavors are absent. So that was in 2015 when my book came out. And 5 years after that, we have seen the global development with the COVID pandemic that, caught the entire world. And now, since COVID, a group of people have been raising the same kinds of questions. Yes, so those are the issues that my book principally focuses on. One, exposing the fact that the dominant narrative around the origin of the Ebola epidemic of 2014 and 2015 in West Africa was not supported by any clinical evidence. Secondly, that there is greater possibility for believing that the outbreak actually originated in Sierra Leone instead of in Guinea. That by locating the outbreak in Guinea and identifying index cases that were not supported by any clinical evidence, the Fabian team prevented the scrutinization of organizations and institutions who have been present in the region, and whose research activities might have potentially triggered the conditions that generated the outbreak. And above all, I raised questions around informed consent and calling for an independent investigation into the research program that was inaugurated in Sierra Leone, at least beginning 2004 up to 2014. Some kind of a disclosure of information that will help us understand whether there's any relationship, whether the outbreak itself was not the result of that research program, the violation of research protocols, and carrying out a dangerous pathogenic research or dangerous defense research in a dilapidated hospital environment in Eastern Sierra Leone. Fast forward, I will say that there is now ongoing effort to request the disclosure of information. A significant amount of internal correspondences have been released recently to a freedom of information request that tends to illustrate some of these the evidence on some of these issues that we have that I have highlighted, I had highlighted way back in 2015 in my book. There was even some congressional hearings attempting to look into the origin of COVID, in which the backdrop of that conversation is triggered by some of these issues that have been raised in West Africa way back in 2015, 5 years before the
COVID-19 pandemic hit. Nice. So in the title, you include this subtitle that says corporate gangsters, multinationals, and rock politicians. Tell me something about this.
Yes, I think looking at epidemics or epidemiological crises of that nature illustrates a number of things. It brings to the forefront legacies of the colonial experience in Africa, where African environments and Africans and African societies have been the subject of medical experimentation, dating back to how far you go. What I was trying to illustrate is the triangular relationship between the neo-colonial state and its indigenous politicians and their relationship with international organizations, whether these organizations are global health governance institutions, including the World Health Organization, the U.S. Agency for International Development that funds some of these research endeavors, and in political actors in Europe and in the United States and North America specifically, who we are thinking about developing diagnostic tools as part of a defense program, and who identified West Africa as a site for the study, as a suitable site for such an investigation or experimental exercise. So issues of sovereignty comes into play. Why would African politicians and African governments authorize the use of their own spaces and the use of their own environments and communities for the experimentation or for the undertaking of such dangerous research projects? And worse, the communities in which these activities are taking place are always unaware that these situations are happening. And even where people tend to raise the flag or blow the whistle on these issues, they are also dismissed as conspiracy theory. And that effort to suppress dissent, to suppress information, to provide a cover for these international organizations and actors who've been abusing African environments and African resources, it's always the local political elites. So when we talk about corporate gangsterism, is an effort to illustrate that ongoing history of exploitation and extraction of wealth, the use of African bodies and African environments for all kinds of experimental projects, and even for extraction of wealth and resources and ideas. And in this case, diagnostic tools for the defense of foreign countries instead of the communities. So endangering the lives of African communities and African people for the service of global capital at the expense of, and we saw the consequences, this epidemic that claimed the lives of ravaged entire communities, and they're still dealing with that traumatic experience, the legacy of that experience. So it's the same thing with the war, where companies and corporations fighting over resources. You look at the Congo, you look at across Africa, the examples are too many. So this was an effort to illustrate how what enables such developments is the triangular relationship between local politicians, private capital corporations, and also the foreign governments, corporate gangsters, multinationals, and rogue elites. And many of these politicians are either badly elected, they rig elections, or they are in power as a consequence of coups. They are also guilty of violating human rights, stealing resources, oppressing their people. So what is the nexus? What weaves that together is exploitation, corruption, extraction of wealth, the administration and oppression of African communities. So that is what, with using the epidemic as an entry point to illustrate that marriage of unholy alliance. That is the source of all these problematic situations we experience.
That's interesting. That's interesting. So, from what you say, and from how you covered the book, I get the picture that this pandemic devastated lives and affected people in tremendous ways. It's something that could have been avoided, maybe possibly. It's something that its impact could probably have been combated in some way. Given the involvement of multinational corporations, politicians, on all that, how would you maybe characterize the possibilities of public health reform, or maybe let me say reparative justice? What is it that needs to be done to protect people from such kind of pandemics?
Yeah, I think it is an ongoing struggle all over the world now, where a handful of individuals have subjected, a handful of nations have subjected the greater majority of the world's population into conditions of servitude. And the consequences of that manifest themselves differently. That is through displacement of populations as a consequence of war, rendering communities homeless because of environmental the abuse of the environment that triggers all kinds of climatic disruptions, and research endeavors that are tied to military projects like what we're talking about, the inauguration of a dangerous biodefense research project in a dilapidated environment that potentially triggered an outbreak that killed thousands of people. So what I'm trying to say is that the struggle here to hold leaders accountable is tremendously difficult, because the institutions that are supposedly set up to provide some kind of a restraining mechanism are themselves controlled by the very governments and institutions that orchestrate
Yes.
some of these situations.
Yes.
So, without sounding pessimistic, I think that is the arduous task that we are engaged in, and our role as activists, journalists, scholars, academics is to always make sure that we are able to spotlight, some of these issues, with the hope that exposing this atrocious violence that is happening around the world, whether it's through activities of biodefense, pharmaceutical companies, or military organizations or institutions, of state authorities, is one way of trying to provide checks. In a way, it's difficult for me to give you a straight up answer to the situation, but I think more people are now talking about, calling for the scrutinization of biodefense research projects, especially with the advent of COVID. There are now increasing conversations around looking into the operation of these laboratories that are carrying out research in the globe, mostly in the global south, where they can easily violate informed consent rules. They can easily carry out, dangerous experimental projects without being scrutinized by local governments and the population.
Oh, yes.
In those parts of the world are not. So I'm hopeful that perhaps this growing conversation might develop in ways that will empower communities, local communities on the ground, with the necessary information that will help make them more aware and put them in a position where they can hold their local authorities, community leaders accountable to some of these issues. It goes down to information dissemination, which is key. I strongly believe that a population that is well informed will find a pathway to national liberation. But these issues deal with the hedge on so many factors, but key to addressing them will be the ability of the greater majority of the world's population to realize their right to self-determination, their ability to determine the conditions of life under which they should live. And that also goes along with the development of independent national economies in liberating this grip that capitalist organizations have on the majority of the world's economies. We talk about Sierra Leone, for example, where the greater majority of the population still live without access to healthcare, access to roads, access to electricity supply. The social services that are meant to provide or support life are absent. And we're talking about a country that is rich with all kinds of wealth, from mineral resources to energy resources to marine resources, that have been constantly looted by multinational corporations. So addressing that history of exploitation deals with a number of things, including the issue of independence, the issue of developing an independent leadership, an independent national economy that takes into consideration the welfare and protection of the lives of its own people. And this goes across different parts of the world, whether it's in Asia, across Africa, in other parts of the world. We're looking at crises all over the world now. Groups of people and countries struggling over control of spheres of influence for resources and geopolitical considerations. And this has devastated and is continuously devastating lives and displacing populations.
My last question for you would be that what's the target audience for this book? What groups of people do you have in mind that you think would greatly benefit if they are to have access to this book?
Well, in 2014, 2015, when I was working on the book, my goal was to respond to what I felt was the, the incapacity of the Sierra Leonean elite and the West African leaders in responding to a crisis, a health crisis of that nature, or any other crisis, and also highlighting um, the the use of African environments in ways that have endangered the population. So I was my target audience at the time were the people of West Africa and also the politicians and political actors on the ground. My goal was to expose um, their collaboration and complicity in endangering the lives of people. I was disturbed by the horrific scenes of violence that accompanied the outbreak, the loss of lives. We all know people, we lost people who we care about, who we know, friends, relatives, distant members, community members. So one was disturbed by that kind of situation. So my response was to expose how we got into that situation as a way of maybe preventing the recurrence of that kind of
Situation.
situation. But interestingly, when the book came out, it had a more wider audience than I had imagined. I later discovered that now it's listed in, in causes around different academic environments, and that was encouraging. So it's still the book came out, I think, in the end of 2015. We launched it in West Africa in January of 2016. So the conversation has been ongoing. And with the 5 years later, when COVID erupted, there was a renewed interest in trying to go back to the same questions and conversation that we've been raising. So there's a renewed interest in some of the issues because now when people many of the scientists who were involved in the research project in West Africa that we highlighted and raised questions about. We're also involved in the outbreak, in the COVID pandemic. They also provided the narrative around the origin of the COVID pandemic. So people out here in the United States and in Europe who were now affected by the same kind of situations that we had experienced in West Africa 5 years earlier, now had to start raising the same questions that we had raised, that nobody was willing to listen. So now more, when the crisis came home, people began to raise the same questions that we were raising. So there's a significant number of people who have become more interested in the questions that we were raising and who are now using that as the basis to understand how they could approach issues of informed consent, to grapple with the questions of the origin of COVID. And they've now gone back to look at some of the questions and issues we've been raising as a basis of providing an antecedent or a precedent to understand COVID. So there is more renewed interest. So there's a global audience for the work. And I'm encouraged to see this renewed interest. I'm hoping that out of that conversation, some kind of remedial actions will be taken to at least restrain the global pharmaceutical industry and these universities who are funding these kinds of research projects to at least rethink the ethics of how they will respect the ethics of research, and also how they will pursue this whole idea of producing knowledge and tools in response to health concerns or security concerns, issues like that. So the audience for the book has cuts across from what you might call grassroots communities, to policymakers, to academics, to students. So it's been out there. But I think we need to revisit some of the issues because the last almost 10 years now since the book was published, events have illuminated, the terms of the of
Mm-hmm.
that work,
Mm-hmm.
which is that there is more that has to be done in looking at
Mm-hmm.
the
Mm-hmm.
legacy of that, how
Mm-hmm.
we understand crisis and conflict in different ways.
Right. So my last question for you, the kind of stuff you unpack, the kind of stuff you research about, especially your work with investigative journalism, is very, very politically sensitive, if I can say. What's the most difficult thing, or what's the most difficult challenge you ever face when you carry out such kind of research?
But the challenges are many. As I speak to you right now, I'm currently in exile in the United States. I cannot return. I completed my PhD. I would like to go back home to help build uh, the history department. For the last 20 years, if I'm not mistaken, I am the only Sierra Leonean that has completed a PhD in history in the last 20 years. So that means there's a significant gap in the production of historical knowledge. And the current generation of historians before me are almost nearing retirement. So, which means that we have in our country a situation where in the next 5 to 10 years, if people are not trained, we will have a country with no historians. So so I'm one of those individuals that has tried to get a PhD in history with the ambition of filling that gap. Now, with my qualification, I have even donated my degree to the people of Sierra Leone. I have even announced that I want to go back home to teach for free in the University of Sierra Leone. We had a university in 1827, and there is no graduate program, strong graduate program in training people beyond the undergraduate level for the most part, especially in the humanities, history included. So the need to address that, and now the state and my work has created this range of clusters of enemies, from professionals, from journalists who are tied to the traditional networks of power, academics. So we're here. There's no solidarity, no sympathy from groups of people who even recognize that there's a need for somebody like me who want to go back home and help rebuild at least the intellectual capacity of the country to rebuild the nation. I've offered to do that for free without a salary, but nobody is willing to accept my offer. So I'm trapped out here in the United States, um, desiring to give back to my country, but cannot be there at the moment. And part of what stands between that is also international organizations that we're talking about, who are using our space and our homeland as sites for all kinds of activities, from the extraction of resources, experimentation of ideas, the things we just highlighted. So it's a paradox that hinges on a number of things. So as a scholar and as a journalist, these are the challenges. That's one aspect. Access to the homeland, access to my own country of birth is now a challenge. The most other difficult thing is the silencing practices that we have to confront with, both in the media and non-media spaces, where knowledge that does not conform to the order of, to the powers that be is always suppressed. It's always fought against. So we have to constantly, in Sierra Leone now, we battle against media institutions, not just within the country, but also outside of the country, who have their vested economic interest in the country. So they fight to isolate, to silence, and suppress your views so that these views do not get out. So which is why we appreciate some of these independent efforts by people like yourself, people to create platforms and avenues that will help to bring these kinds of conversations to the attention of our people who would ordinarily not have access to some of these information. So it's an ongoing, the problems and the challenges are many, including death threats. As I sit here, I receive all kinds of messages from death threats and from supporters of the government, from corporations. Sometime a year ago, we even published in the African Express evidence of the government of Sierra Leone hiring cyber companies, what you might call cyber mercenaries, to attack my social media pages and bring down our website. So that's a constant. We fight even to get our information out. It's a problem. And these efforts are not just done by the local corrupt elite, they are supported by international organizations and institutions
Wow.
who are operating in the country. So the challenges are many, but regardless of those, it's impossible to sit down and look at injustice, look at oppression, silent around it. So we just have to do what we're doing. We hope that
you do what
there
you
are
can.
people out there who also are in solidarity with the things that we do. And again, which makes your work also tremendously important in creating these alternative spaces, platforms where we can have this kind of conversation.
Disseminate ideas. Yes, yes, definitely. Dr. Chernoh, I don't know how to thank you, but this was wonderful having you on the podcast today. Viewers and listeners, those of you who would like to access a copy of Dr. Chernoh's book, do not forget to hit the link that is in the description panel on the upload for this video. Dr. Chernoh, thank you and have a good day.
Thank you.
That's wonderful.